Through the first two parts, the framework and then the examples of practice, that will mainly be me talking. I'm also using this mic because this will all be recorded. So if you want to see it later, you can. Don't feel like you need to write everything down. You will have the slides and you will have my audio later. And then basically like right at the halfway point, we're going to transition to small group discussion at your tables, and we might merge some of the tables if you're at a very small table or you already know everyone at your table. And then we're going to come back together at the end and share out what we've talked about in small groups. So with that format in mind, I want to take a second and talk about our goals for this workshop. So my goal is for you all to learn and reflect on our framework for using data to solve problems in cities. I want you to critically discuss with your peers about the best practices that you're seeing in your own work, and then also connect that framework to your own practice, and ideally have some next steps and takeaways for your own work after you leave this room. So what I want to do first is get a sense from all of you before we dive in too deeply. How many of you are actual city government employees? A few. How many of you are university folks? A few. Private sector, nonprofit, other folks? A few. Okay, so we have a good mix. I'm very glad that we have a good mix because I think the difference of perspectives will be really useful for us and at each table. So if you're at a table where literally it's everyone you know and you all work for the same city, when we get to the group session, I encourage you to go make some new friends and sit at another table. It'll be a better discussion, I think. So those are my goals for the day. What I want you to do really quickly to kind of get us thinking is, you have Post-it notes at all of your tables. What I want you to do is think of one question that you want to have answered. We're talking about solving city problems with data. I've given you no other context. What do you want to have answered by the end of this session? I want you to write it down, and then I want you to bring it up to me, and I'm going to collect them and sort them so we can answer them throughout the day. If you have a question about that, please start doing that. Think about it. Take a minute or two. If you want to use the silver pens on the table, I'm not sure why we even have silver pens. You can use them, but if you want to borrow a pen from your friend that's black or a different color that's not silver, that would make me very happy. So take a minute or two to think about it and use those Post-its at your table and write it down. And when you're done, just go ahead and bring it up to me. Okay, I think I got most folks. So what I'm going to do, just so that you all know, is when you're doing your small group discussions, I'm going to be sorting through these and grouping and categorizing them, and we're going to answer them at the end of the day to the best that I can. One other thing that I want to do before we jump into the presentation is actually this whole table here. This is the rest of the GovEx team. There's about 15 of us, so some of you maybe know some of these folks, but they're also going to be participating throughout the day, and if they ever feel like they're slacking, let me know, because they have to participate. So what I want to do now is actually start off with the story about data-driven decision-making in a city government, and then we're going to dive through kind of our framework. So these are two guys. This is the beautiful city of Las Vegas, Nevada, and they had a big issue with fire and emergency services calls. In 2010, they got about 87,000 calls a year. This past year, they had hundreds of thousands, more than doubled in the last 7 years. There are a lot of reasons for that. They weren't really trying to think about why people are calling, but they were knowing that they couldn't handle that current call volume. They were stretching their resources too thin, and often if you're sending a fire truck to someone who's calling 911, you're not meeting their needs, because not everybody needs a fire truck when you call the fire department. Seems intuitive, but that's actually what's happening. People call 911 because they don't know who else to call. Right? And so what they started to do with this data that they had that told them they had way too much volume to actually meet the needs of their residents was a three-pronged strategy which involved prioritizing those calls based on their urgency, education for residents at the point of time. So have you heard about teachable moments when people call 911 and you deliver a service and they actually don't need 911? They had a plan for talking to people about other services they could access, as well as long-term service provision to negate people having to call 911 for their problems. And so each of those different use cases, they developed through their own analysis of data in the city. And they ended up implementing this over time to reduce that volume, but also to have better long-term outcomes for their residents. Right? So this is a very quick story. It's ongoing. This is in progress. We worked with them to develop this system, and they continue to tweak it. But I like starting with that story because it's a very common issue. It's for something that we can all relate to. How many people have ever even called 911? I know that I have. Right? What happens when you call 911? Usually they send a police car or a fire truck or an ambulance. We have no other options, right? So they're starting to look within those options and seeing what else can we do to actually meet the needs of people who are calling us for this very simple service. So I want you all to think about stories like that in your own work as we go throughout the day today, because this is a very simple issue with seemingly very simple solutions at the end of the day. Nothing radical, nothing, game-changing. We don't like to use the word innovation. This is not really all that innovative. It's just providing better service using the data that we have. And so I wanted to start with today is what does that really mean to be data-driven? What does this story tell us that others do not? And so there's a variety of directions that we could go. We worked with New Orleans on their New Orleans STAT program, their blight STAT program, to reduce blight in their community. Kansas City is using big data, open data for a variety of things on 311, on their own blight issue, but also in their budget. Baltimore was looking at data and fire hydrants and parking tickets. And then Oklahoma City was actually using their data to target and provide better services to new immigrants in their community. So all these are relevant stories, and data can help us in all these different areas if we know what we're looking for. What we don't have across all those issues is a way to singularly focus on this and put this data, put this theory into practice. There's a huge gap between the academics in this room and the actual practice that goes on the ground. So we do lots of theoretical research, and city governments are actually doing lots of research, but they're not really connecting. What is the way that we can do that? We also need to think about what are the best ways to actually implement the research from academia into city government. So we need to have a two-way conversation and a two-way dialogue. And most of our work at GovEx is really focused on that issue, and we're focused on the practical side. So our framework, we've worked with about 100 cities across the US and some international, was really focused on the practical first. So most cities come to us with a problem. We got some problem that we need to fix, or we have some issue that we need to address. And the way that we think about addressing it is, have you actually articulated this issue clearly? Are we really talking about the right problem, or we just think we have some problem? How do we identify problems in government? Any city council people in here? I know there were some earlier. City council person says so it's a problem. I heard from grandma on my block, so it's a problem, right? But is it a real problem? Right, so that's the first thing that we ask people to do, really clearly articulate what you're trying to do. The second, you need to address that problem. You need to try something new. You need to put some solution into action. And then third, you need to assess. Is that addressing that you're doing, is it actually having the impact that you want? So this seems very simple, but even within each of those, right, there are multiple steps. So we want people to identify problems, engaging stakeholders, and clearly stating their problem, and on and on. But we're going to go through each one of these today, kind of in a little bit of depth and detail, and then I'm going to have you all discuss and think about how to apply that in your own work. So I want to pause there and see if there's any questions before I dive into the real meat here. Good question. What should we do first? I always start with articulate, because no matter what you're doing now, you can always benefit from taking a step back and looking at what you're actually doing. And literally, many of the times I talk to people in government, they don't have it written down anywhere what they're actually trying to do. Like nowhere. It's just we did this because the person before me did it, so like I kept doing it. And actually taking a step back and writing down and clearly articulating is where I like to start. But in reality, it's a loop, but you can go back and forth. It's not like a clean circle, right? It's just different steps that you need to think about. That's a very good question.
Well, and the devil's advocate on that is, unless you establish some sort of a data baseline, it's difficult to, as you're going back to the assessment part, what are you assessing it against? Because there's got to be some sort of measurement. And if it can't be measured, it can't be a requirement. So, I mean, you can have a requirement, you can say something's a requirement, but if you can't measure it for success, it can't really be a requirement. So that's huge.
I think that's huge, but I think that in reality, we do tons of things that are not measured. Whether they can or can't be measured, they are not being measured, right? And so what I want you all to think about is what stage and what point should we be doing at your own work? Are you needing to define measures for something that you've been doing for 100 years? and that's what you really need to do? Or do you need to have a baseline, or do you need to be assessing the clear measures that you've already created? Right? We're all at different stages, and I think that having this as a tool just to think about as a thought exercise where you can play devil's advocate against me or against yourself or against the mayor, let's hope you're all doing that against your mayor and council people, to really investigate and think about what it is that's happening in your city and the services that are being provided. Well, if you have any other questions throughout, feel free to just interrupt me. I want this to be very interactive, and we're going to do the small groups as quick as we can. But before we do that, I want to kind of go through each step with all of you with just some examples that we've taken away from our work over the last couple years with cities in the US. So these 4 parts of Articulate are the parts that I think are the most important. So identifying your problem, engaging with stakeholders, exploring the data that you have, and then going back, clearly stating the problem that you're trying to focus on. So first, identifying problems. So I actually do want to do some cross. How do you identify problems in your own work? City council person said so. That's 1. Clearly the most important. Resident requests. Are you looking at your own data? I hope you all have self-selected into the solving problems with data session. So I hope that you're looking at data to help you identify some of those problems. You're seeing discrepancies or gaps or outliers, and you're using those to start. Often the federal government says we have to do something, so we do it, or the state says we have to do something, so we do it. These are other ways, but I think having all those in mind is really important because often these people are talking about similar problems, but they're not articulating them in the same way, or they're not talking about them in the same room. And so being able to cross them as yourselves, kind of central government people, is really important. Stakeholder engagement is really important, and since this is the 21st Century Neighborhood Summit, we all need to be thinking about new ways to engage our stakeholders. You'll hear me use throughout the day today the word resident and not the word citizen. Stakeholders including businesses. I'm a stakeholder here in Baltimore, even though I don't live in Baltimore, I live in DC, but I come to Baltimore very often. I would argue that my interests are important to the city as well. So there's a variety of ways and people that we need to think about, and think about engaging them in new ways where they are. So that's really, really important to articulating clear problems, in my view. And then exploring data. So this one I really wanted to show you all. How many of you are Baltimore residents? Good. How many of you have seen the Baltimore Open Data Portal? Almost all of you. That is awesome, because most people are not aware that the Baltimore Open Data Portal exists, nor do they use it for anything at all. And so what I want you all to think about is, when you're exploring data, are you exploring the whole universe of what's out there to you? There's a ton out there, that all the way down to granular local open data. That you can use. And so many times cities will ask us, well, we need to collect some new data, but they actually haven't explored what's out there first. So I would encourage you all to really dig through and see what you already have, to see what other departments in your cities have, because often there's data there that's not being tapped or not being used particularly productively. And then lastly, clearly stating your problem is really important. You've done some exploring, you've done some engagement, you identify, but you really need to clearly state this. And I really like this example from Tacoma, Washington. We worked with them for a few months really thinking about how they're articulating budget measures, but about a year later they used that whole process to really think about cross-cutting initiatives throughout the city. And specifically their focus on affordable housing stock will be a theme and a story I'm going to talk about through the other examples. Yes?
Articulate piece. You know, one of the things that my sense is that this part is missing, and I'm curious when you're thinking on this, is that there's also a question of the person who's doing the exploration, both in terms of the data and identifying the problems, kind of their own frame as to how they're even engaging the problem itself. And so if I can give a concrete example, let's say we're looking at crime and we're looking at, you know, crime reduction, that there's a way to look at the data, and the data can conceal certain elements of what's happening in community, that if you don't have a lens that can see the things that are concealed or missing, and what the data is producing, then it leads to solutions to problems like more policing as a crime fighting strategy, as opposed to looking at other metrics, and that there is a tendency, particularly those trained in traditional academic institutions with a very traditional disciplinary focus, that there is a tendency to be limited in how you explore the data, how you identify the problem, therefore producing even more problems, giving the frame that the person who's approaching that problem engages. I'm curious about how that fits into this initial piece.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, that we all have our own frame and our own bias, no matter what, right? We're gonna have to engage with that at some point. And the most important thing for this part, there's really two pieces that I like to say for this part, is write something down and then show it to someone else. Are you showing it to the people that are gonna be affected by the problem that you're articulating? Are they agreeing with you that it's the same kind of problem? Are you showing it to your boss or someone who sits next to you? Do they have a different take? And so I think it's really important, as we are the data people, to actually be people focused, right? We should be showing everything that we're doing to other people to try to get outside those frames, right? Because I think you're exactly right. We can get locked in to the same kind of solutions to the problem that we're trying to solve because we're looking for it, right? But I think if you try to, as best as you can, to engage with people outside of your own frame and actually talk to people, it's probably the best solution that we have seen from other cities at this point. So it's not a great answer to your question, but I think that's the best that we're seeing out there today. Very cool. So the next thing I want to do is just really quickly give a kind of example of this from Denver, where we've talked about some of these earlier today about homelessness, about affordable housing, and the example of Denver and how they're redefining and rethinking about how they articulate and how they define homelessness. So they were looking at data from repeat criminals who are homeless people who are going and trespassing or frequently getting booked for drinking in the streets, so they go to jail because it's warm, it's cold in Denver in the winter, right? They're not really criminals in the sense that if we provided them a different service, they wouldn't go to the jail. And so what they started to do is really think about what is the problem we're trying to solve, and they clearly articulated a coalition of different folks: housing authority, homeless services advocates, homeless people themselves. What are you really doing? Why are you engaging these behaviors? What can we do to help? And they articulated this new strategy which really focused on how to break that cycle with permanent housing, right? So they're doing a housing first model as well, where they're doing permanent housing. Right, so that's just an example that I really like because it involves the different steps within that process that I just articulated. So the next step, this is the one we usually just skip right to. We want to put our data into action. And the different parts of that I think are critical as well. So once you have a problem that you've articulated, what are you going to do? So the steps that I like on this are determining the type, analyzing your data, making a decision, and then actually deploying that solution. And all of them I think are discrete steps. So the first one, and I apologize if this is kind of hard to see from the back, is determining the problem type. So this is just a screenshot from the New Orleans. It's called NOLAlytics. I don't know if there's anyone from New Orleans here. They have a whole program where they're using analytics in government, and they've identified, I think this is 6 different common problem types that their government staff are facing. And they are finding a needle in a haystack, prioritizing work, early warning tools, building quicker decisions, optimizing resource allocation, and experimenting for what works. And they've found that 90% of the problems that they're dealing with in the city fall into one of these categories, which have a systemic way of dealing with them that they already know. We know how to do resource allocation if we have the right problem type. And if that's the kind of question that you're facing, we probably have some resources for you to help you solve them instead of trying to solve them new every time. So their approach to determining a problem type was very systemic, where they define these in advance and they circulate this with people to see how they can fit it into their own work. Then they're analyzing the data. So you really need to think through, this is the number crunching part. This is usually the shortest part of this cycle that I'm talking about. You have your problem defined, you've determined the type, and now you crunch the numbers and analyze the data. The critical piece about analyzing data is what comes next. What do you do with that data? What action are you going to take that's different? And what are you going to do that's going to make a difference for the lives of your residents? So this is almost, again, like I said, it's almost always a people first thing. Some person has to make some new decision with the data. It's not inherently useful. And then last, once you decide, how are you going to deploy that solution? So this is another shot. I think this is from New Orleans, where folks were actually engaged in their own communities and documenting and addressing blight after Hurricane Katrina. They already had people going into their communities. They're going back. How can we address and identify and take action with the people that are already in the communities that are dealing with blight? The quick story that I want to tell for address is from Vilnius, Lithuania. So I actually did this project myself with the city of Vilnius, where they were really focused on helping parents find kindergartens for their children. So the city is growing, it's booming, People are moving into the city, but it's still a fairly small school system, and they have the ability to, if they do an intervention right now, they can solve some future problems. And what they decided to do was, we know that the problem is parents can't find the right kindergartens. Parents are applying for the same 3 kindergartens because they're the 3 best ones and they're the only ones that people know. We need to get the word out about other kindergartens that are out there. So they built a tool that's online and that they do in public service areas for people who don't have internet access, where they're actually walking them through the different places where there are kindergartens that are near their home and work, and that they actually have a chance of getting into, instead of everybody applying for the 3 schools that they're not going to get into. So I really like this example because it was their key critical problem that they identified, and then they have a solution that they're implementing, and then they're going to tweak this going forward to make sure it's meeting the needs of their residents. So we met the mayor of Vilnius, and Sharon will correct me if I'm wrong, but this was actually at an event, I think somewhat like this event, where the mayor of Vilnius was there and he said, we have this thing, we would like to see if you guys can help us. So then we engaged, and this took about 6 months for us to do this partnership with them. It was strictly based on like random chance relationship building. Otherwise, I don't myself get to Lithuania all that often. I wouldn't recommend it now, it's very cold right now, but that was all about network building that we've done. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
And what kind of problem is it of the 6 types that you just listed?
So this is actually a resource allocation problem for the parents, right? So we're trying to solve the closest, best way to meet their needs based on their resources. So the key thing actually for this one was that we were adding their place of work as a place for them to think about where to send their kid to kindergarten. People know that like 3 kindergartens around their house almost always, and it's really difficult to get past that little bubble. So our goal was to get them past that and to think about different areas of the city potentially nearby their work. Long term, this is also integrated with transportation planning, because if all these people are going to one area of the city and they're working there, we need to optimize travel routes as well for that. All right, the last thing before I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to hand it all over to you for a small group discussion. So the hardest part, I think, is at the end, evaluating success and planning for next steps. And so these 3 steps, I think, are fairly self-explanatory again, but I think that they're often skipped over in the work that we do in government. And so evaluating success can come in a lot of different ways. This was a group of folks where they had done a project, and it was literally like a round table. We're going to talk about what we just did. Was it successful or not? Very qualitative focus. But I think that should be a key part of assessing your work as well, in addition to the measures, as we talked about, but gathering feedback, as well as planning for adjustments. So I like this photo because it is a packed house of people waiting for a local government person to like tell them about some update from a project they were doing. And this is something you need to think about as you're doing your assessment, as you're planning your project, that there's lots of people that are going to be waiting for you to do this and talk about it and plan for those adjustments from the beginning, and finally put them into action. This is of another photo that I really like from our partners in Lincoln, Nebraska, where we help them to launch a STAT program. They have cross-departmental leadership, and that's actually the mayor right there in the gray suit, thinking about how they're actually going to deploy solutions based on the assessments that we were doing. So the last example, just really quickly, is another housing one from Portland, where they were using the data to think about their affordability, where they were using the concept of, they call GATOR, Government Accountability, Transparency, and Results. And the idea that they were doing is they were thinking about permitting only in terms of their work on affordable housing. How can we use the permitting process to kind of stem the tide of growth, or to figure out the best way to do growth? And what they actually determined was they needed to focus on a variety of factors. When they did an assessment, their strategy wasn't working. Permitting was not the key to unlocking, making Portland more affordable. I don't know what it is. I don't think they do either, but they know it's not just permitting, right? And they only know that because they looked at their data and they actually sat down and did an assessment of that. So I want to stop talking now. I've been talking for a while. I want you all to think about this framework. So it's very basic. I think there's some basic steps, but I want you all to think about your own work and how it maps up to what you're doing on a daily basis. And so what I want you to do is, in small groups, think about the framework and compare it to your approach, and also thinking about the approach that you should use in your own work. And finally, my favorite question, the one that I ask in every workshop that I lead with cities, is what are you going to do that's different tomorrow, 1 month, and 6 months, if anything, if you found anything useful, what are you going to do that's different in your own work? So what I would encourage you all to do is we have good small groups here to stay at your table. Think about this in your own work for a minute or two and then discuss in small groups. I'll float around if you have questions. And then we're going to kind of report out to everybody back at the end. So if you want to, volunteer someone to talk for the group, that's fine. You want to vote, I don't care how you do it. Just have someone that's going to talk for the end of the group. So we're going to take, somebody remind me what time it is right now. So let's take about 15 minutes in small groups and we'll report out, okay? Yeah, you all. Yeah, feel free to. Okay, I hate to break up good conversation, but I do it a lot. You get used to it. So what I want us to do now is have each group kind of just quickly report out on what they talked about in their small groups. So if you designated someone, please have them talk. And also I'm going to ask you all to use the mic as well, so that it'll be recorded for posterity. So any group that would like to volunteer to go first, or I will choose at random. Yes, awesome. Here, Tiffany, here you go. And then I'll sit at the front.
Who's over here?
Tiffany on our team is going to be like the royal mic passer. So.
Boy, it got quiet all of a sudden, too, didn't it? So my name is Lauren McManus. I'm a police officer with the city of Sioux Falls. And at our table today, we kind of came to the conclusion that we're all facing the same struggles. We're working on open data portals, and the struggle is how do you combine all of the data from the different city government agencies into a usable format that somebody can search and work with. And there are some agencies that don't want to give their information up or don't want to release certain parts of it. But the work that's been done, at least from our side in Sioux Falls, has been pretty good right now. We're fairly transparent in our government, but we're very early in the process. But that's been the big struggle, is just trying to figure out how do you take data from code enforcement and engineering and fire and police and make it available in one particular spot that's going to be usable for everybody.
So what I want to do is have every table go around. So if you're hearing that was a great summary, please model this behavior. Anyone else want to go next? Yep.
I'm Jeff Ash. I'm with the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm in IT, heading up the data analytics. And it's the challenge of, we talked about that the data tells stories, and how do you deal with the fact that the data is going to tell some stories that there are going to be people that don't want those particular stories told? And so it's the question of, what data and how do we present it in a way that talks about the goals that we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to aspire to?
Just volunteering him. Hi, Darryl Polk with the city of Rancho Cucamonga, California. I'm the CIO for the city, so get your pain, brother. So what we kind of talked about was some of the issues that come with the pre-existing anecdotal and sentimental views of these problems that we're addressing, that a lot of these are legacy problems that the community's been dealing with for a long time, and people have their opinions and don't necessarily want to be swayed by data. And so it's how do you approach it with veracity and with the ability to tell a story that people will accept and understand, rather than dumping a CSV file out on the web and saying, hey, go to town. And the problem with open data specifically is when you do that, if you don't have the tools for people to make their own correct assumptions, someone else will make them for you. Someone else will develop those tools. Someone else will, and hopefully it's an academic institution, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's, just some wingnut that decided they want to use that for their cause. And that kind of, I know for our city, that's given us pause and given us caution. We have an open data site. We have put performance metrics out there, but we really do assess everything before it goes out. And we're trying to avoid the data hoarding that we heard. But the only way to get around that is to give those department heads and directors kind of a fuzzy blanket to hold to say it's going to be okay, and here's how we're going to make it happen. So. That's us.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Brown. I'm the Enterprise Data Manager for City of Raleigh, and we have Baltimore represented here too. So we had a lot of the similar discussions to what everybody else said, but we also talked about engagement and who's really using our open data and how do we make it more friendly for them to be able to use it and not just put that data set out there and have a story that goes along with it and also be able to find stuff. Like it's all there, but how do you put it together and string it together to actually make a difference for the citizen and not necessarily just the academics or just the city itself?
Hi, I'm Pamela Whiteman with the City of Charlotte. So at this table, we discussed an example of how we're using data to determine what the amount of our next housing bond is. So in Charlotte, we have a deficit of affordable housing. So we talked about how we are using data to determine what that supply deficit is, and also how do we look at the number of people who are housing insecure, meaning that they're paying more than 30% of their annual income for their household expenses, and then how we could use the amount that we as a city have put in per unit historically to determine what that next bond is.
There's only 2 groups left, so.
Hi, my name is Tarika. I'm an evaluator for the Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Delaware. Okay, so we were looking at our approaches versus the framework that you're using. Some of the differences that we found was one of the problems, we're getting data from secondary data sources rather than firsthand data. And someone mentioned analyzing housing data from outdated data sources, or just in general using outdated data sources. That's a tongue twister, sorry. Other challenges that we came up with or found was we were wondering how do we have data and how do we use data in a way that's useful once we gather the data and analyze the data, that's useful and digestible to not just ourselves internally but to the external community. Also, we talked about another similar to what other people said, combining data from larger data sources, different departments and such, and then how to continuously keep it updated so that we can stay up to date with that data. And then lastly, updating data consistently. Oh, no, yeah. Yeah, oh, did you want to say? Okay. And I think lastly, someone mentioned just to how to engage stakeholders in the process of the data collection itself.
So we talked about a lot. One of the things that I mentioned was that, I'm not an employee of city government. I'm a policy director for a grassroots think tank. One of the things that we talked about, and one of the perspectives that I offered, was that it strikes me as odd to talk about data that isn't attached to a worldview and attached to an objective. Data is something that is informed by those who produce it. And whatever normative frameworks that you use to understand what constitutes data, whatever kind of sociological biases that you internalize, they impact what constitutes data. And if there's not an objective attached to it, then there are ways in which those biases, the ways in which those normative frameworks of how society is structured are reproduced by the nature of the data. And the example that I gave was that, like, one of the things that we criticize a lot in Baltimore, white-led nonprofit organizations that are able to get large sums of money and are able to control the discourse and framework for how the success of those organizations is metricized. And so a part of what happens is the data they produce are data that isn't necessarily data that the community is interested in, attendance, participation in enrichment activities. So I think that's an important piece of it, that understanding data is something separate from
both the worldview of those who produce it and the objective of the data is supposed to help inform, to me is a strange practice, both intellectually as a matter of policy.
So I think those are all really good points, and what I want to do is quickly synthesize what I've heard and what I'm writing down here. Is a couple of things. So basically I heard 3 different themes. So we're thinking about data itself. How do we collect it, share it, open it? Is it high quality? Stuff like that. The second part that I heard was about engagement, about people, about worldviews, about what are the actual policy issues and problems we're trying to solve and determining those first before we get into data. And then the third part was actually about uses. Who is going to use the data and for what? And to what end, right? I think those are the different themes that I heard throughout the different kind of conversations that you all talked about. And what I want to do is offer quickly just 2 stories just that came to mind from me, and then I want to kick it back to you all at the very end here as we close to kind of think about what we're going to do next. So one story that I talked about, and remind me of the gentleman you named from Rancho Cucamonga, talked about some wingnut taking your data and doing something with it that you don't know what it's going to be. This is like the worst case scenario for most city government employees. We put some data out there and somebody goes and uses it. And the story that I really like, and maybe some of you have heard this story, comes from New York. And there's a guy named Ben Wellington. He runs a blog called iQuantNY. And he basically takes open data sets and he does analysis. He does sorting, all kinds of things. And he looked at a data set about parking fines in New York City, and he just sorted them from which parking space gets the most fines to which one gets the least amount of fines. And then he compared that to a Google photo that says, it looks like this one that gets the most fines is not signed properly, because that's why it's getting fines. People don't know that they're not supposed to park there, and then they get a citation, right? So he presents this information to the NYPD. What do you think happens? What? Any thoughts? Put up a sign? So most people would say most people have a kind of dim view of the NYPD. They would say that they would like ignore this information and go about their business, right? What they did was they changed. They re-signed the thing. They were training people to not find places that were not clearly marked. They had a process now to actually identify spaces where people were being fined when they shouldn't be. Right, this is an ideal case where some wingnut, this guy, he's very smart. Many people would characterize him as a wingnut. But he's brilliant, presents some information to the city, and they have something that they can do with it now, right? So I think that that's a really interesting use case where if we really want to get people past that fear, we have to show them use cases where the world is not going to end because we produce some data that someone else did something with. And I think that's a real fear for people. So being able to tell stories like that and show examples, I think, is really important for the regular, city government employee who really is worried about that, because either it's going to make them look bad or make the city look bad, and they don't want that to happen. So I think that's a really interesting story. And then the second piece I wanted to just talk about really briefly with you is just all these themes across about sharing and about engaging people, is that this work with data, like the big irony, right? Like it's actually about engaging with people and talking to them, talking with them, building with them the solutions for their own communities. So this is solving city problems with data, right? There are problems and there are people who have problems. That's what we're doing for government. And so I think that we need to keep it in our minds that, yeah, we're sitting our spreadsheet, we're going to crunch some numbers, but at the end of the day, it's about the people that are being affected by this and how we're going to engage them and how we're going to work with them to build solutions. I think that's really the key thing. So we always talk about data, but there's never this separation from the people that are going to be affected by the data that you're analyzing or using. So those are just the really 2 quick anecdotes that I wanted to share. And then I wanted to end our session with the last 10 or 15 minutes or so, really focusing on this last question. So I put it on there specifically because I want you all to think about it, but I really do want you all to do something differently coming out of this session, if it makes sense. So I'm curious to hear if any of you all actually talked about that in your small groups, and if you're willing to share what you are going to do differently, or why you're not because I'm wrong. That's cool too, right? I want to have that discussion about this framework and think about what we can do together and what we can do individually coming out of this room as you go back to your jobs, this afternoon and tomorrow. So anyone want to volunteer? Again, I will pick a table at random and just drop the mic in the middle.
Well, I just think what was highlighted in the story that your Dave Vaughn shared, and I think it's something that we were doing organically without like actual conscious thought. What is actually trying to figure out why the data is telling us what it's telling us, and looking beyond, well, that's just what it is. And so trying to really understand our community and why things are occurring the way they're occurring. And we were talking about some, just historical things that have occurred in the U.S. with housing policy or patterns and so on and so forth. But kind of digging deeper, okay, now that's what's going on here. What would change look like? Who would have to be at the table? And why would they want to be at the table? So that's what I think I hope to keep doing.
Thanks. Yeah, we discussed that as well. One of the challenges that I was saying was with the work that I do, we're currently at the end of a grant cycle, just to summarize, and I do evaluation for the grant. So, but the new funding has already come in. So as I collected I'm using the data from 5 years of a program and collecting that data, writing reports on that data. The new funding has come in. So basically, we're already funded before we've actually reported back as to what our results were for the 5 years of programming prior. So one of the ways that I said I could, in my work, change or try to make a change and use this framework is just when the program is implemented for the next 5 years. I can't do it externally, but internally I could take that information and now just use it to inform the programming that we're doing for the next 5 years. And then Adria had suggested possibly even going back to our funder and asking them if they could, suggesting that they find a way to build in that part of evaluation into the funding application so that it's data informed.
Anyone else?
We didn't really talk about this, but I'm going to put a plug in for Tulsa because we're getting ready to put a competitive sealed proposal together to get a visualization tool that can present the data that we have cleaned. They're not going to accept. We're not going to let people cross into our operational systems. That will never happen. But we're looking for that. So if you're a vendor and you do visualization tools, would you come talk to me because there's going to be a competitive seal proposal going out probably sometime next month. So.
Anyone else? Okay, so what I want to do to end today, we're going to end a little bit early so that you all get some of your time back. But the idea that I want to do to end really quickly is you all gave me these questions. What I was doing while you were talking in small groups was sorting them, thinking about themes, thinking about different ways to answer them. So the first big theme that all of you came up with across all the groups was actually about sharing and different aspects of sharing data. How do you get different people to share data with you? How do you share data back to people in ways that are usable for them, and ways that they can then, do with what they choose or protect, what you need in the use case that you have. So that was one big theme. A second big theme was actually about collecting data yourself. So not sharing, but how do we gather data in a way that makes sense, in a way that's strong practice, in a way that's protected. That was the second theme. A third theme was actually about specific policy cases. So there are a few questions about housing. And actually, I think this gets back to Damon's question about what is the frame, what is the actual use going to be. I think that's really important. The third character, or I guess this is the fourth one, was actually about thinking about use. How do we actually implement data-driven decision-making in our own cities? And then we also had some questions about skills, visualization being one of them. I don't know if this was the question about visualization. Maybe. All right. Oh, well, I'm glad that you told me you didn't do what I asked. Thank you. But what I want to do really quickly is there's two that I picked out on purpose because the two people who are positioned to answer them are here on our team, and it's not me. So one of them is about how we're applying what researchers are doing in our work at GovEx, and so I'm going to let Catherine talk about that really quickly.
Cool, thanks, Eric. Thanks for the question, whoever wrote it. So I'm Catherine Klosek. I'm also with GovEx. We are taking on a new scope of work that we're calling applied research. And so as Eric has talked about, and as many of you know, for the past 3 years or so, we've been working with cities on advancing their data and analytical practices, open data, and so on. And through doing that, we've actually collected a really rich data set of the topics that cities are interested in, that mayors and city managers have said are top of mind for them, and the strategies that cities are actually using. We have a little bit of insight into what's effective and what isn't. So we're taking that and trying to match it with the brain power that we have at Johns Hopkins University, where GovEx is located, and say, you know, in these fields, what are the best and proven practices that you know about? Talking to researchers and subject matter experts there. And then we're going to kind of cultivate that and share it back out with cities so that going forward, we're providing technical assistance on these particular policy topics that we know that mayors are interested in. We're also going to be developing cohorts of cities that are interested in and working on these topics and policy areas. So some cities might be, you know, we might be providing technical assistance in actually implementing and testing these policies. Others might just be curious in learning a little bit more about it and speaking directly with the researchers who have done the research and found the evidence. So there's going to be varying levels of engagement focused around, again, specific policy areas, starting at Johns Hopkins University, but we hope to be able to expand the network that we're drawing on for that brain power to other universities as well. So that's the plan, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or after.
Thank you, Catherine. And the other question that I wanted to highlight was actually about how you get started with data science. And I'm going to have Matt stand up and not answer the question right now, because what you should do is stay for the next session that Matt's going to lead about getting started with data science in government. And so I think that's a really hot topic these days. Yeah, sit back down, Matt. I think it's a really interesting topic, and you know, it's a buzzword that people are interested in, and Matt is going to kind of demystify some of those things, as well as talk about how to practically implement data science projects in your own work. So stick around for that, if that was your question. And what I want to leave you with really quickly is just a couple of next steps that I would have and ask for all of you is to determine how to apply this in your own context, or whether, you know, you want to come up with your own way because you don't like the way that I framed it, that's fine. But think about how you're going to apply this in your own work. The second is to network with your peers. Maybe you have an upcoming sealed bid that you need to talk with someone else about how they did it. That's the kind of stuff we want you to do to learn from each other. And then finally, if you have questions about applied research or anything else, please do get in touch with us at GovEx. We're always happy to talk. This is our website link there. We have all kinds of resources. We're happy to talk to you in person. We have a podcast. If you haven't had enough of me today, Sharon and I host our podcast. So there's all kinds of different levels of things that you can get involved in, and we encourage you all to do that. The last ask for you today is everyone's passing out a survey. We really do take these seriously, so please fill this out on your way out. And I want to thank you all for participating.